A brilliant law student dedicates her life to defending the innocent, while the man next door dedicates his to planning the perfect murder. They shared a wall, they shared classrooms at a prestigious university, but behind his quiet, awkward demeanor was a methodical predator, watching her every move through a stolen camera. This wasn't a random attack in a dark alley. This was a slaughter engineered by a legal mind, one that almost outsmarted the justice system, until a garbage truck failed to run its route. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Macon, Georgia sits right in the center of the state, a city defined by historic Southern architecture and a thick, suffocating summer humidity that clings to the skin. It is also the home of the Mercer University School of Law. For the ambitious students navigating its rigorous programs, the pressure is relentless. They are trained to dissect evidence, understand the criminal mind, and master the intricate mechanics of the justice system. The Barristers Hall apartment complex, a modest, slightly weathered building sitting just across the street from the campus, served as a convenient sanctuary for these exhausted future attorneys. Lauren Giddings was the brightest light in that demanding environment. At 27 years old, the Maryland native carried a quiet but undeniable gravity. Raised in a fiercely close-knit family, she grew up playing softball, radiating an easy, natural athleticism. After earning her undergraduate degree, she set her sights on Mercer with a specific, unwavering mission. Lauren did not want a lucrative corporate law career. She was driven by a profound, genuine empathy, determined to become a public defender. She wanted to stand in court for the marginalized, the broken, and the forgotten. Classmates gravitated toward her because she was the rare type of person who genuinely listened, remembering the smallest details about people's lives and ensuring no one ever felt invisible. In the sweltering early summer of 2011, she had just graduated and was spending her days locked in a grueling study routine for the upcoming bar exam. She was standing exactly on the precipice of the life she had spent years building. Living right next door, sharing the exact same floor plan, was 25-year-old Stephen McDaniel. On a roster, Stephen was a peer, another recent law school graduate preparing for the bar. In reality, he occupied a completely different universe. Raised in the quiet, affluent Atlanta suburb of Lilburn, Stephen was undeniably intelligent but fundamentally broken on a social level. While Lauren effortlessly drew people in, Stephen repelled them. He was infamous among his peers for his unkempt, disheveled appearance, his erratic mannerisms, and an intense, unblinking stare that made everyone around him deeply uneasy. He was the classic outcast, a man who rarely spoke unless it was to deliver a jarring, inappropriate comment that silenced the room. But his awkwardness masked a terrifying psychological landscape. Stephen's isolation was not just a byproduct of social ineptitude. It was a breeding ground for dark, festering fixations. Behind the locked door of his apartment, he immersed himself in the bleakest corners of the internet. He was obsessed with weaponry, violence, and true crime, viewing humanity through a cold, detached lens. He had absolutely zero criminal history. To the local police, he did not exist. To his professors, he was highly capable but strange. Yet the very institution teaching him how to uphold the law was simultaneously arming him with a dangerous toolkit. Stephen was meticulously mastering the rules of forensic science, police interrogation tactics, and evidence disposal. The thin walls of the Barristers Hall apartments offered little true privacy. Lauren resided in apartment number 2. Stephen occupied number 3. Their living spaces were separated by mere inches of drywall and timber. They even shared an outdoor balcony. To Lauren, Stephen was nothing more than the eccentric guy next door, someone to politely tolerate in the hallway before turning the deadbolt on her front door. She was entirely consumed by her textbooks, her friends, and her impending move out of Macon. She had absolutely no reason to suspect that the socially inept classmate living on the other side of her bedroom wall was no longer focused on passing the bar exam. He was focusing all of his analytical energy entirely on her. The Federalist Society was the veneer of their interaction, an academic organization that required a modicum of professional decorum. Lauren served as its president, a position requiring organization, leadership, and a visible, bustling energy. Stephen, predictably, served as the vice president. It was an arrangement of convenience that allowed them to be in the same orbit without requiring a true interpersonal bond. Lauren viewed him with the professional tolerance one offers a difficult colleague. She was oblivious to the reality that for Stephen, the proximity of the Federalist Society provided the ultimate vantage point. While Lauren was busy networking, planning for a future in public defense, and nurturing her social circles, Stephen was conducting a silent, invisible audit of her life. He wasn't just observing her, he was cataloging her routine. He took note of the specific times she arrived home, which keys she used, and how long the lights in her apartment remained illuminated. The mundane details that Lauren dismissed as part of her daily grind were, to Stephen, data points in a project that had begun to consume his waking hours. He utilized the most intrusive of methods to bridge the gap between their two apartments. Stephen had acquired a small, high-resolution camera, the kind used for clandestine observation. He meticulously rigged this device to a long, sturdy pole. From the vantage point of his own apartment or the communal balcony they shared, he could extend this apparatus across the narrow gap to peer directly through Lauren's window. He spent countless hours in the dark, bathed in the glow of a small monitor, watching her sleep, study, and exist in the one place she felt entirely secure. This wasn't just a violation of privacy. It was an exercise in total psychological possession. His fixation manifested in a digital dossier that would later shock forensic investigators. He had scoured the deep web and public databases, compiling an exhaustive list of information regarding Lauren's background, her family, and her habits. He was not looking for romantic connection. He was looking for vulnerabilities. He knew the floor plan of her apartment better than he knew the interior of his own. He understood the layout, the locks, and the weaknesses in the building's security protocols. The relationship, if it can be called that, was a masterclass in deception. Lauren would occasionally bump into Stephen in the stairwell. She would offer a polite, tight-lipped smile, perhaps a brief inquiry about a class assignment. Stephen would respond with a rehearsed, socially calibrated answer, his gaze remaining fixed on a point just to the side of her face. Lauren never noticed the lack of warmth. She was too preoccupied with the pressures of her final semester. She treated him as a background character in her life, a slightly odd neighbor she would never have to deal with again once she moved on to her legal career. She did not know that her every movement was being synthesized into a plan. Stephen McDaniel had begun to view his own life as a series of obstacles, and Lauren Giddings had inadvertently become the centerpiece of his fantasy. He had moved beyond the phase of mere voyeurism. The camera on the stick was no longer sufficient. He started purchasing tools, not for school and not for a hobby. He bought things that could be used to breach a threshold, to neutralize resistance, and to handle a body. His descent was methodical. There was no sudden break with reality, no explosive manifestation of a mental health crisis that his peers could easily identify. Instead, there was a steady, cold solidification of intent. He stopped attending classes. He spent his days in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the precise moment when the circumstances would align. The Federalist Society, the law degree, the peer group, all of it became a shell he wore to move through the world undetected. Inside, the project was nearing completion. He had the keys, he had the tools, and he had the target. Lauren remained blissfully unaware that her next-door neighbor had already decided she was not leaving the Barristers Hall apartment complex alive. The countdown to June 26th began in the silence of his apartment, marked only by the flickers of her bedroom light through his surveillance monitor. He was simply waiting for the right kind of darkness. Macon in late June is suffocating. Even in the dead of night, the humidity sits heavy in the air, wrapping around the brick exterior of the Barristers Hall apartments like a damp woolen blanket. The temperature rarely dips below the upper 70s, leaving a sticky, oppressive atmosphere that permeates every shadow. It was the early hours of Sunday, June 26, 2011. Inside apartment number 2, Lauren was deeply asleep. She had spent the previous evening just as she spent most of her days, focused, tired, winding down after a grueling stretch of studying for the bar exam. The complex was entirely quiet. It was that profound, heavy 4 a.m. silence where the ambient noise of the city dies away, and even the low hum of an old refrigerator feels uncomfortably loud. Next door, in apartment 3, Stephen was wide awake, He was not studying. The psychological countdown he had initiated months prior had finally reached 0. He dressed meticulously in dark, non-reflective clothing. He pulled a mask over his face, obscuring his features and transforming himself from an awkward, socially inept law graduate into an unrecognizable, predatory threat. He stepped out of his unit and crossed the narrow outdoor threshold to her front door. There would be no forced entry tonight, no shattered glass or splintered wood to alert the sleeping neighbors. During his obsessive surveillance and planning, he had managed to obtain a master key to the building. He slid the metal into the deadbolt. A soft, metallic click echoed faintly in the damp air. He turned the knob, pushed the door open, and stepped into her sanctuary. The intrusion was practically silent. He navigated the familiar layout of her living space, a floor plan absolutely identical to his own, with practiced precision. He avoided the floorboards that might creak. He moved like a ghost down the short hallway, his eyes adjusting to the pitch black. He entered her bedroom. Lauren woke abruptly to a living nightmare. There was a masked figure looming over her bed in the darkness. The ensuing struggle was desperate, violent, and agonizingly quiet. She fought back with everything she had. She fought for her future against an assailant she could not recognize, entirely unaware that the hands gripping her belonged to the classmate she shared a wall with. The physical disparity and the sheer shock of the ambush were overwhelming. He pinned her down against the mattress. The tension in the confined room spiked into pure, suffocating terror. He used his hands to cut off her airway. The struggle was a terrifying exertion of kinetic energy. Short, chaotic bursts of movement, the frantic shifting of sheets, the desperate gasping for oxygen. But the apartment walls were just thick enough to muffle the tragedy unfolding inside. No neighbors woke. No one called the police. The frantic resistance eventually gave way to a horrific, permanent stillness. The fight ended. The oppressive Macon humidity remained, but the bright, ambitious life inside apartment number 2 had been violently extinguished. It was approximately 4:30 in the morning. Stephen was now standing in the dark, breathing heavily, entirely alone with her body. The adrenaline of the assault began to ebb, rapidly replaced by a cold, clinical detachment. He did not panic. He did not immediately flee the scene. The extensive education he was supposed to use to defend clients in a courtroom was now being ruthlessly applied to a murder scene. He knew the apartment complex would soon wake up. He knew that attempting to drag a body out to his car in the morning light was a guaranteed invitation to a lethal injection gurney. He had to wait. He moved Lauren's remains into the bathroom, placing her inside the bathtub to contain the biological evidence of his crime. Then, he simply existed in her space. He waited as the sun rose over Georgia, casting light through the blinds he kept tightly drawn. He waited as the ambient sounds of the city and the complex bled through the thin walls. He could hear other law students waking up, walking down the exterior stairs, and leaving for the library. He sat mere feet away from the victim he had just slaughtered, demonstrating a level of psychological compartmentalization that defies basic human comprehension. For over a dozen hours, he monitored the environment, calculating his next tactical move with the exact same hyper-focused intensity he applied to his legal exams. He was in complete control. When absolute darkness finally returned on Sunday night, the second phase of his plan commenced. The cover of night provided the necessary shield for the grotesque mechanics of disposal. He retrieved a hacksaw, the specific tool he had purchased weeks earlier for this exact scenario. What followed in the confines of that small, fluorescent-lit bathroom was a display of utter depravity and calculated butchery. Stephen began the grueling, mechanical process of dismembering the body. This was not a quick or easy task. It required immense physical exertion, a strong stomach, and a complete sociopathic detachment from the reality of what he was doing. The sharp, metallic smell of copper filled the small space. He severed her limbs. He decapitated her. He systematically reduced the empathetic woman he had stalked for months into manageable pieces. The sound of the metal saw grinding against bone was muffled by the running water of the shower, masking the auditory evidence of the desecration from anyone walking by outside. He worked relentlessly, attempting to strip away any identifying features that could quickly link the remains to his missing neighbor. Once the dismemberment was complete, his focus shifted entirely to forensic countermeasures. He meticulously cleaned the bathtub, the ceramic tiles, and the surrounding metal fixtures. He deployed harsh chemical agents to break down blood and tissue, relying heavily on his deep dive into internet research regarding how to beat a police investigation. He scrubbed the scene, attempting to obliterate his DNA and any microscopic trace of the slaughter. He then wrapped the segmented remains in heavy plastic garbage bags. He packaged the torso, the largest, heaviest, and most difficult section to move, with particular care, double bagging it to prevent any leakage. In the dead of night, he carried the black plastic bags out of the apartment, his muscles aching from the exertion. He walked them to the large communal dumpster located at the far edge of the Barristers Hall parking lot. He hoisted the heavy bags over the lip of the green metal container, letting them drop heavily into the refuse below. He believed the city's sanitation schedule would handle the rest. The garbage trucks were due to empty the bins later that week. In his highly logical mind, the trash would be collected, compacted, and incinerated in a massive landfill miles away, obliterating the only physical proof of his actions. He returned to his own apartment, locked the deadbolt, washed his hands, and prepared to resume the facade of the strange, quiet law student. Day X had concluded exactly as he had engineered it. Monday morning broke over Macon with the usual sweltering heat, but the digital hum of Lauren's life had inexplicably flatlined. She was a woman deeply anchored by constant, daily communication, heavily tethered to her family back in Maryland. Following the joyous, chaotic blur of her sister's recent wedding, she was expected to check in continuously, to finalize her upcoming travel plans, and to lean heavily on her support system as the daunting bar exam approached. Instead, text messages went entirely unanswered, sitting unread in the digital void. Voicemails stacked up in the dark, greeted only by automated prompts and the sterile beep of a full inbox. The silence was immediate, jarring, and entirely out of character. For the first 24 hours, her inner circle tried desperately to rationalize the void. They assumed she was exhausted, buried under a mountain of study materials, or simply unplugged for a much-needed mental reset. But as 48 hours evaporated into Wednesday, that logical rationalization morphed into a suffocating, paralyzing dread. The social echo of her absence began to reverberate fiercely through the Mercer University community. Law students, typically consumed entirely by their own academic survival and the looming terror of final exams, began to look up from their heavy textbooks. Anxious whispers snaked through the library aisles, across the manicured courtyards, and into the local coffee shops. The Barristers Hall parking lot sat unchanged. Her car was still there, baking under the unforgiving Georgia sun, parked in the exact same spot she always used. A 27-year-old woman with deep community ties, a beloved dog, and a brilliant future does not simply walk away from her entire existence while leaving her primary mode of transportation behind. The collective anxiety finally peaked on Thursday, June 30th. Responding to desperate, pleading phone calls from her family, the Macon police arrived at the complex to conduct a formal welfare check. Uniformed officers climbed the exterior concrete stairs to apartment number 2. They knocked forcefully. They waited in the stifling humidity. The only response was the heavy, stagnant silence of the southern summer. Securing emergency access from the property manager, investigators turned the deadbolt and stepped cautiously inside the dark unit. The scene was chilling precisely because of its absolute, terrifying normalcy. There was no overturned furniture, no shattered window glass, no defensive wounds or blood spatter painting the beige drywall. The apartment simply smelled of old air conditioning and undisturbed, settling dust. Her laptop sat waiting on a desk. Her rigorous study materials were neatly arranged, paused mid-thought. Her purse, containing her identification and credit cards, was gone, along with her keys and cell phone, but the atmosphere felt entirely wrong. Law enforcement initially leaned heavily toward a theory of voluntary disappearance, suggesting perhaps the crushing pressure of the upcoming bar exam had triggered a sudden, unannounced retreat to clear her head. Her friends and family violently rejected that premise. They emphasized to the detectives that Lauren was fiercely responsible. She would never abandon her life, her pets, or her family without leaving a digital footprint or a quick note. As the official missing person investigation formally launched, the local community mobilized with frantic, nervous energy. Classmates quickly printed hundreds of missing person flyers, plastering Lauren's smiling face across downtown storefronts, utility poles, and campus bulletin boards. Volunteer search parties formed organically, sweating through their clothes in the relentless 90-degree heat as they combed nearby streets, overgrown vacant lots, and local parks. And moving silently, confidently through the absolute center of this desperate swarm was the man from apartment 3. Stephen did not barricade himself in his room to hide from the growing police presence. He displayed a terrifying level of psychological compartmentalization by actively embedding himself into the very search efforts dedicated to finding his victim. He accepted thick stacks of flyers from weeping classmates. He canvassed the neighborhood sidewalks. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Lauren's closest friends, offering them quiet, stoic nods of solidarity and faux comfort. Beneath his disheveled, famously awkward exterior, he harbored a cold, arrogant certainty. He was playing the ultimate role, fully convinced that the city sanitation schedule had already erased the grotesque consequences of his horrific actions. He believed the biological evidence was already miles away, safely buried under tons of compacted, incinerated refuse at the county dump. He was fatally wrong. His meticulous, heavily researched forensic countermeasures had been entirely derailed by a single, mundane logistical failure. When the police initially swarmed the Barristers Hall parking lot to conduct the Thursday morning welfare check, their network of cruisers and unmarked vehicles created a dense physical bottleneck. The city garbage truck, rolling heavily through its standard morning route, found the complex's narrow lot entirely impassable. Unable to navigate around the flashing lights and parked sedans, the sanitation driver simply skipped the pickup, planning to return on the next cycle. The large green dumpster at the edge of the property remained untouched, baking in the suffocating heat, holding its terrible secret. That same afternoon, a local news crew from WGXA descended on the complex to broadcast a live report on the missing law student. A reporter spotted Stephen loitering near the yellow police tape of the crime scene perimeter. Recognizing him as a direct neighbor, she pulled him aside for a quick, on-camera interview. He willingly stepped into the glaring light of the television lens. Wearing a baggy, oversized gray shirt, his hair wild and unwashed, he delivered a chillingly flat performance. He spoke calmly about his missing classmate. In a massive, subconscious psychological slip, he repeatedly referred to her in the past tense, noting that no one had seen her in days. He told the reporter he was simply a concerned friend, playing his part with unnerving, sociopathic detachment. Then, the live feed captured one of the most remarkable, visceral moments of psychological collapse in modern criminal history. Mid-interview, the reporter received a frantic, real-time update through her earpiece from the station producer. She turned her microphone back to Stephen and asked if he had heard the absolute latest development from the active police line. She explicitly informed him that investigators had just discovered a dismembered body part wrapped in plastic inside the complex's parking lot dumpster. The physiological reaction was instantaneous, violent, and impossible to fake. The arrogant certainty shattered in real time. The blood violently drained from Stephen's face, leaving him a sickly pale. His unblinking, predatory stare broke immediately, his eyes darting frantically from side to side as his highly logical mind tried to process the catastrophic, impossible failure of his master plan. His jaw literally dropped open. He emitted a high-pitched, strained gasp, a primal sound of pure, unadulterated panic. He asked the reporter to repeat herself, his voice trembling and cracking, as the crushing reality of the unemptied dumpster crashed down upon him. His knees buckled visibly under his own weight. He mumbled incoherently that he needed to go sit down, stumbling awkwardly away from the glare of the camera lights, clutching his head in his hands. He was no longer the brilliant, untouchable legal mind. He was a trapped, terrified animal, realizing on live television before thousands of viewers that his perfect crime was unraveling entirely before his eyes. The live television collapse was broadcast directly into the living rooms of Macon residents, but more crucially, it was viewed by the lead detectives at the precinct. The investigation pivoted instantly. The frantic search for a missing woman transformed into a focused homicide inquiry, with the crosshairs locking dead center on the man in the oversized gray shirt. Down in the sweltering parking lot, crime scene units processed the heavy plastic bags retrieved from the green container. Inside lay the torso. The brutal reality of the discovery settled over the investigators. The city sanitation schedule had partially executed the killer's design. Earlier trash collection cycles had already emptied the adjacent bins. The remainder of her body was gone, lost somewhere within a sprawling county landfill, buried beneath thousands of tons of compacted refuse. A massive, grueling search of the dump site would eventually be organized, but the punishing Georgia heat and the sheer volume of waste made it an agonizingly slow, ultimately fruitless endeavor. The community shuddered as the gruesome details leaked out. The paralyzing fear that had gripped the law school mutated into sheer horror. The threat was not a random drifter. The predator had been sitting next to them in lectures, taking the exact same exams, walking the exact same halls. But building a capital murder case requires more than a bizarre reaction on the evening news. Detectives had to systematically eliminate alternative theories to ensure the defense could not introduce reasonable doubt. They chased the necessary red herrings. Could it have been a violent local offender with a history of home invasions? Was it a transient passing through the nearby downtown corridor? Investigators pulled security footage from adjacent businesses and interviewed known criminals in the area. Yet, the total absence of forced entry anchored their attention firmly inside the building. The perpetrator needed a key, and he needed proximity. They brought the next-door neighbor into the interrogation room. What unfolded over the next several hours became a masterclass in psychological abnormality. He sat in the sterile, windowless room, exhibiting behavior that deeply unsettled even the most seasoned investigators. He locked his body into a rigid, unnatural posture, sitting perfectly upright, remaining virtually motionless for hours at a time. He stared blankly ahead, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond the detectives, offering only monotone, evasive responses. He thought his absolute silence was an impenetrable shield, a legal strategy he had absorbed in the classroom. He refused to break, challenging the authorities to produce hard, physical evidence. They needed a legal mechanism to keep him detained, while crime scene technicians dismantled his apartment. A preliminary sweep of his residence yielded the perfect pretext. Investigators uncovered an assortment of items stolen from other units within the complex: personal belongings, undergarments, and a stolen master key to the building. He was not just a quiet student, he was a serial prowler who had been systematically violating the privacy of his classmates for an extended period. Police formally charged him with 2 counts of burglary. It was a highly strategic maneuver. Those relatively minor charges slammed the cell door shut, denying him bail and buying the forensic teams the crucial hours they needed to tear down his physical and digital walls. The execution of the search warrants revealed a space scrubbed with chemical precision. The suspect had utilized heavy bleach and industrial cleaning agents, attempting to erase the biological narrative of the weekend. But flawless crimes exist only in fiction. Microscopic traces always remain. Technicians dismantled the plumbing, swabbing the pipes, and discovering localized traces of human blood trapped deep in the drains. More damning was the discovery of cardboard packaging for a specific brand of hacksaw tossed carelessly in his bedroom. The blade's listed dimensions perfectly matched the distinct tool marks left on the recovered cartilage and bone. The physical chain of evidence was rapidly assembling itself, anchoring the spotless bathroom next door directly to the plastic bags in the dumpster. Yet, the most devastating blow to his defense was extracted from his own hard drives. The suspect believed he was a digital ghost, operating under the arrogant assumption that dragging files to a virtual trash bin equated to permanent deletion. Cyber forensics experts easily resurrected the erased data. The recovered cache provided a terrifying descent into his methodology. Investigators unearthed the clandestine videos recorded from the camera fixed to the pole, showcasing his extensive covert surveillance of her bedroom window. The time-stamped files proved he had been watching her in the days and weeks leading up to the ambush. His search engine history read like a step-by-step manual for premeditated slaughter. He had queried the internet for specific techniques on avoiding detection, the exact decomposition rate of human tissue, and how to effectively bypass standard police interrogation methods. He had explicitly searched for information on whether a severed human torso would float in water. He had tracked her online activity, monitored her social media, and cataloged her schedule with terrifying precision. Every keystroke was a digital fingerprint of malice aforethought. The intricate web of physical evidence, combined with the irrefutable cyber footprint and his bizarre behavioral profile, created an airtight narrative. The brilliant legal mind had engineered a highly complex operation, anticipating almost every variable, except a blocked garbage truck. Stephen McDaniel, facing an insurmountable mountain of forensic and digital evidence, knew a trial would be a public dissection of his fractured mind. The defense had nothing, no alternate suspect, no alibi, and no logical explanation for the hacksaw packaging or the recovered surveillance videos. Those digital breadcrumbs were essentially a guaranteed death sentence in a Georgia courtroom. In April 2014, the arrogant law graduate finally surrendered to the very legal system he thought he could completely outsmart. He accepted a plea deal to avoid the execution chamber, officially pleading guilty to the murder of his neighbor. The mandate was swift and definitive: life in prison. Under the strict terms of the agreement, he will not be eligible for parole until the year 2041. There were no dramatic theatrics or prolonged legal battles. The courtroom proceedings were reduced to the cold, bureaucratic processing of a killer. He offered no genuine explanation for the slaughter, and no emotional apology to the grieving family sitting just rows behind him. He simply answered the presiding judge's procedural questions in that same flat, deadened monotone, officially sealing his own fate and permanently closing the legal file on the Barristers Hall horror. Lauren Giddings wanted to dedicate her life to the broken and the defenseless. Her legacy survives in the public defenders who walk into courtrooms every day, fighting for the justice she was so violently denied. But the Barristers Hall case leaves a lingering, deeply unsettling echo in Macon. It shatters the comforting illusion that predators only lurk in dark alleys or abandoned lots. Sometimes they hold advanced degrees. Sometimes they sit beside us. And sometimes, terrifyingly, they share our walls. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.